the outset, as it captures what I hope might be at the heart of some of our discussions today. But yes, this really has been written very much with you in mind. So let's see how we do. There's a way to survive these times, and I think one way is the shape that the telling takes. I love this quote from Ali Smith, the British novelist, book Spring, which I'm going to spend a little bit of time on today, but it doesn't matter if you haven't read it. I've deliberately devised this to sort of riff off my own work on Ali Smith, and you'll see why as we go along, but I hope it might inspire a few of you to pick up a copy if you are so inclined. So I'm going to try and touch on, as this whole lecture series is, I suppose, on how stories adapt and travel over time and across cultures, languages and forms. But it's also really important for me at the moment in the work that I'm trying to think about how stories in our present moment are embracing the contemporary issues. And for me, contemporary issues of displacement and migration, and the imperative, as I see it, of the refugee experience in our pandemic, climate and geopolitically unsettled times. And so I wanted to start not with Shakespeare at all, but with a very recent travelling story. And some of you may have read or seen or even engaged with this project at some point. Little Amal and the Walk Project, which was I suppose, a kind of extended, expanded form of street theatre, a performance over many weeks and months that saw a 3.5 metre tall puppet travelling, worked by 3 individuals, travel from the Syrian border with Turkey to the United Kingdom. And that took place, that walk, in the second part of 2021, starting out actually on the 27th of July. And I'm going to loop back on this astonishing kind of performance event a number of times in this talk, in ways that I hope will focus on this concept of global Shakespeares in interesting ways. And I hope you'll see why it becomes a story about adaptation for me. And any of you that had time or inclination to look at the chapter from Sandra Young that I suggested might be a bit of helpful background reading to some of the things I might touch on. But if you have looked at that very brilliant introduction to her book on Shakespeare and the Global South, it will have indicated that a version of this talk could have talked at length, as her book does, about non-Anglophone or alternative versions of Shakespeare produced and created in and for global South contexts. And I'm really interested in that work, and I've certainly been thinking about that in research recently in relation to Asian Pacific interactions with Shakespeare in particular. But actually today, as I say, I'm going to just use a single authored UK novel, Ali Smith's 2019 Spring, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And as I say, not having read that isn't, I hope, a barrier to the discussion we can have afterwards. And that novel has a particularly resonant relationship with a Shakespeare play called Pericles, Prince of Tyre, which is probably one of Shakespeare's less well-known plays. So you can see that I quite like hanging out in marginal space. But Pericles, Prince of Tyre is itself a story of travelling and a travelling story. Shakespeare himself was already, when he co-wrote Pericles, adapting work by the medieval poet John Gower. And that was itself, John Gower's medieval poetry, a retelling of an ancient story. So layer upon layer, and I'm sure you've been hearing from others about the kind of palimpsest effect of adaptation and accretion that happens to texts over time. So I want to use that particular exemplar or set of literary relationships, Ali Smith, Shakespeare, Pericles, to indicate how part of the travelling story's effect of adaptation is the way in which also Anglophone adaptations of Shakespeare are taking in the global issues of the times, reimagining his plays and his plots through particular critical and indeed creative lenses. And in fact, Maria was talking really interestingly when we were just hanging in the waiting room, as it were, about a recent feminist adaptation. So lots that could have been used, but this is my example. So I should just say a little bit more about the Little Amal and the Long Walk project and the concepts and the creative teams behind it. And Good Chance Theatre, who were previously actually best known for staging Shakespeare's Hamlet in the Calais refugee camp that was known as the Jungle. And that was part of the Globe Theatre London's Global Hamlet project in 2016. And the Globe's actually a space and place that will recur in this talk. But they joined forces with Handspring Puppet Company, who are very famous in the UK for their work on a stage adaptation of a Michael Morpurgo children's book called Warhorse, which was just a huge theatre hit and ran for many, many years. And in fact, when Amal, the puppet, finally visited London, they actually had the Warhorse puppet meet her at the National Theatre. So a little bit of a moment of kind of inter-theatrical reference. The places, though, that Amal visited and travelled through and the varying responses are just worth pausing on really, really briefly. She began in Gaziantep in Turkey, where there's an extremely high concentration of displaced Syrian people, travelled through Tarsus and Izmir, also in Turkey, into Greece, where she visited refugee camps such as Katsikis and other well-known camps like Moria in Lesbos, I'm going to return to in this talk. She was denied entry into one town in Greece by a mayoral authority in a fairly blatant statement of Islamophobia, and she was stoned and openly attacked by anti-immigration protesters in Larissa. These weren't theatrical stagings, this was real reaction to the puppet. She travelled on to diverse port cities, including Naples and Marseille, and then by way of other sanctuary cities, including Cologne. So so-called cities of permanent temporality that are in our era are being made and reimagined by wave after wave of immigration, as they have been over the centuries. And eventually Amal travelled to the UK, beginning on the beaches at Folkestone itself, the site of migrant landings on a daily basis now in the United Kingdom, and travelling over several days through key sites in the capital city of London, and then on to other key cities, ending in Manchester in the north of England. And then she briefly re-emerged in Glasgow in Scotland as part of the COP26 United Nations Climate Summit in November. The puppet represents a 9-year-old, 10-year-old by the end of her journey, displaced Syrian girl searching for her mother. That's the arc of the story. She's reaching for settler status. She's seeking a place to call home, a very archetypal story, and I hope we'll see very much a story of our times and our world. And this particular image that you can see on the slide at the moment is from the London Saturday that I participated in, which began with Amal arriving at St Paul's Cathedral in London to deliver a letter and a gift from Tarsus in Turkey, and Tarsus was St Paul's birthplace, so there's a kind of linking of the places. And the gift was a wooden carving of a ship at sea, which is a symbol we will return to on a number of occasions. Tarsus is, interestingly, a setting and location in Pericles. So I'll come back to that as a resonant cultural geography and another example of cross-temporal, cross-cultural connections that adaptation studies for me pull out and draw out and pull upon in really fascinating ways. It's a kind of networked theory of adaptation that I hope might emerge, and I'll return to some of the key theorists on that, from Doug Lanier to Poonam Trivedi to Professor Voits himself on that in just a moment. So a brief reflection on the day in London and the experience of walking with her is probably worth me saying. And it started at St Paul's, as I say, and when the Dean of St Paul's was handed that wooden ship, this was the statement that he made, a very powerful statement. Our hope here for London is that it's big enough to receive all those who seek refuge in this city. So really being used as a piece of theatre, a piece of congregation, very interesting itself in the time of the pandemic as we were gathered outside and safely, but also to make statements about the current political position on migrants in the United Kingdom. So on my day, the experience was to walk with her from St Paul's through the day till the light fell, crossing bridges, moving up and down the symbolic site of the River Thames. And you can see here in the picture on the right here, looking out to the waters, crossing the Millennium Bridge to Bankside. And Bankside is the cultural and artistic home of London's theatres since the 16th century, since the time of Shakespeare. So hopefully you'll begin to see that this puppet will take me to global Shakespeares and to a discussion of adaptation, and that you'll see the link shortly, even if not already. But I'm just going to hope to show a small video clip, which it seemed to work a minute ago, so I hope it'll work again. It really is very short, so just bear with me. It's nice for you, I hope, to see the puppet actually moving. She was a strikingly fast walker, actually, which is really impressive. And you can see from that little clip taken on my phone that this was at the National Theatre, which has its own resonances, of course. As well as visiting the Globe Theatre on Bankside, the reconstructed theatre on the site of the original 16th and 17th century theatre for which Shakespeare wrote many of his plays, a part of the walk I'll return to at the very end, she visited the National Theatre and she was greeted by a community choir. And the song that you hear the very beginning of there that they chose to sing was from a production of a sea-soaked Shakespeare play from 1608 to 1609 called Pericles, Prince of Tyre. And Tyre is actually today in modern Lebanon, another coastline site that's very important in the story of migration, and I've had the privilege to actually stand in and look out from, but there we go. I was actually there researching the role of theatre making in refugee camps, so the story resonates in various ways. But the community choir that welcomed Amal at the National Theatre had been formed as part of that 2018 production of Pericles at the National Theatre, and it was a group called Public Acts, and it was all about making diverse and inclusive theatre, so community theatre for all. And it was really fascinating that this play, this unusual play of Pericles, was the one they chose to speak to the culturally diverse, many first and second and even third generation settler migrant communities of London. So part of this is to keep asking why? Why Pericles? Why now? Why Shakespeare? Why now? And why then an ancient story like Pericles felt like the most urgent retelling for an act of theatre about contemporary issues of social justice and inclusion, and why in turn it resonates with the Little Amal and the Walk Project, and that choice to use that song from that production to greet this puppet of a young Syrian girl, and what in turn it might tell us, or me, about the writer Ali Smith's own deep encounter with this Shakespeare play as part of her process of writing in 2018 to 19. So why Shakespeare? Why Pericles? Why now? And I suppose the answers are always many and various on Shakespeare adaptation. The path is strewn with failed attempts to provide singular definitions of adaptation at its best, but something best understood, as I've argued for a long time, as process and practice. And you can just see there a really lovely still of some of the young children performing in that Public Acts Pericles. I love that octopus. That's just such a great puppet. So I said I would just say something very briefly about sort of adaptation as network theory, because you can see what I'm doing. I'm like a magpie, one of those birds that likes to collect shiny things and then see what the accumulation of them, what stories that might start to tell in itself. Some of the things you may have heard about in other lectures on this wonderful series, but certainly really important and very influential in Shakespeare studies. Douglas Lanier's work on rhizomatic or network Shakespeares, which appears in a collection called Shakespeare and the Ethics of Appropriation, you might like to follow up on in more detail. And more recently, a wonderful talk I heard at the Asian Shakespeare Association, which was actually held in Seoul. I was, of course, online in the middle of the night, just echoing some of Hebon's experiences for next week. But Poonam Trivedi spoke about the banyan tree as a methodology. And I use this quote in a recent piece of writing from M.J. Kidney. Adaptation as an evolving category is closely tied to how the work modifies over time and from one reception space to another. So I'm really interested in this idea of the network and the rhizome of non-hierarchical horizontals, that there's no single top point, as it were, in a pyramid, that every text in this story is valid in its own context, forms and moments. And seen from that vantage point, we might describe the history and process of Shakespeare adaptation via metaphors of travel and horizontals, and best imagined through a kind of widening motion, with a starting point at what might be thought of as the oldest form of adaptation in itself, theatre, because theatre, the medium in which Shakespeare worked, expanding from there to sort of cross-media adaptations, theatre remakes itself every single night. It is constantly adapting. But adaptation studies does take us from one genre to another, to novel, to film, to music, to animation, and eventually to the recasting of material to entirely new creative ends, what we might call here in this talk today in our discussion, cultural studies and/or appropriation studies. So if Shakespeare adaptation takes place every time a theatre group stages their particular production of a play like Pericles, they make collective choices about text, about costume, about casting, about setting and venue, and then they hand it over to different audiences made up of different individuals with different lived experiences on different days to fashion their own meanings. And there's even been work recently about the different weather in a space like the globe and how that can change reaction even on productions during a matter of hours. And transcultural or intercultural performance studies have also long made the point that adaptation theory is sometimes dangerously English language dominated, dangerously Anglophone, missing the multiple cross-cultural exchanges and new constructions of meaning that take place when Shakespeare is remade for Chinese, for Japanese, for Indian, for Mexican, for Italian, for Romanian, for many more languages, cultures and contexts. And so global Shakespeare's, that phrase in my title, is an increasingly vibrant, polyphonic, multi-voiced, often activist area of scholarship, engaging with Shakespeare's work, as Sandra Young has demonstrated, from a context of diasporic mobilities. And she talks really interestingly in her work about the fact that in travelling the globe, traditional Shakespeare has been dismantled and reimagined. And she says the results illuminating for cultural studies. And I would just really like those two phrases as things to play with and experiment: dismantling and reimagining. And if there's anything we need to be doing in this current age of ours, I think it's that. All of this that I am describing, I think, is Shakespeare adaptation, and yet there's still more to come. We can talk about cross-generic, intermedial transformation, or to use J. David Bolter and Richard Grusin's term, which you may have come across on this programme already, remediation. What takes place when canonical texts like Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet are rethought as film, as game, as music, as musical, as dance or graphic novel. So Shakespeare as a resource is what really interests me. Something, an entity, a set of possibilities, a meeting point that's useful to different ages, contexts, cultures and positions. So again, to just give you a Sandra Young quote, scholars have celebrated Shakespeare's availability as a resource for writers, activists and politicians during anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggles. And contemporary theatre makers have drawn on Shakespeare in a manner that complicates the dichotomies of early cultural histories that embed Shakespeare within a forbidding colonial canon. And I think particularly in the UK at the moment, what's called decolonising the curriculum work that's going on, I think Shakespeare is finding new expression and a new permeability for students in that space. I'm really interested to see what happens next. So today, as already mentioned, my effort is to talk to you about global Shakespeares and travelling stories, but I'm focusing not on Global South reimaginings, but this contemporary Anglophone novel based on Shakespeare's Pericles, Prince of Tyre. And that's both a highly particular question, selection, asking, why adapt this strange Shakespeare play? And it is quite a strange Shakespeare play. I love it, by the way, at this time and in these ways. But I hope it will be more applicable to you, to other kinds of examples or example genres. It's worth saying that I think Shakespeare adaptation studies has emerged as a really powerfully networking and connective force and sometimes quite disruptive subfield itself within international Shakespeare studies. And I think as these performances and interpretations and scholarship emerging from the global South and post-colonial contexts are sort of offering radical challenge to Western paradigms, there's more to come. So a consideration of global Shakespeare's as adaptation pulls what I'm defining here as appropriation studies, a sort of now recognised subfield, into the discussion. Acts of adaptation that involve a conscious writing back to Shakespeare and to the Western cultural precepts that prescribed his cultural value, and therefore fostering the ongoing study and circulation of his texts. Shakespearean appropriation is a sort of umbrella term for works, responses, and versions. And you've got an expert in Eckhart on versioning here, but versions that actively make visible post-colonialism, feminism, LGBTQ plus positionalities, critical race studies, gender and transgender studies, and eco-critical or social justice frameworks for Shakespeare. Shakespeare adaptations and appropriations are strongly informed by the critical positions circulating at any given time. And the example of critical race studies has really brought new focus to adaptations of Shakespeare's memory acts that interrogate race in the plays themselves, but also diversify the stories they tell. And Shakespearean adaptation studies is increasingly making us look forward and orienting us towards forward-looking agendas. So citing Shakespeare as a vehicle for engaging with present issues and challenges, as I say, from migration to climate to identity politics. And I think they're all particularly resonant as to why Pericles at this present moment. So thinking about what Shakespeare adaptation is could produce a teleology of the discipline of English literature, but it really picks up on its porous edges. Literary studies is porous, global, networked, and intercultural. So as well as trying to determine this what of adaptation, I'm also interested in this why Shakespeare is adapted in so many different forms by so many different cultures and in so many different moments. And I am going to use just one case study, but I hope it gives you something to apply and run with and think with for yourselves. The role of Pericles in this talk is intended to mobilize one set of possibilities for exploring this question of why Shakespeare, why adaptation. And by taking this less frequently known play and by identifying what's quite a deep contemporary strain of interest in adapting it, I'm focusing on the why now. Why do some plays or texts come into sharper focus for adaptation in particular moments? Why do we get clusters of interest? And how might that cluster or resonance inspire further recirculation? Another object, the Lampedusa cross in the British Museum, a bit like that carved wooden ship from Tarsus that Amal presented to the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. The Lampedusa cross was made by Francesco Tuccio, a carpenter who in October 2013 painstakingly retrieved fragments of a boat from the coastline of the island of Lampedusa in southern Italy, a boat which had been carrying hundreds of migrants from Eritrea, which sank, killing 366 of those on board. Tuccio fashioned maritime fragments into crosses to mark the lives lost. And this singular object, one of the Lampedusa crosses, is recorded in the catalogue entry of the British Museum where it is housed, that it stands as witness to the kindness of the people of the small island of Lampedusa, who have done what they can for the refugees and migrants who arrive on their shores. It was acquired in 2015, and it offers a poignant connection for visitors to the museum to one of the major issues of our age, mass migration, much of it conducted across oceans in perilous small boats and undertaken in the face of climate-based conflict-induced hardship. And many art forms, including film and fiction, aimed at predominantly global North readerships and audiences, have sought in recent years to engage with this ongoing crisis, as it is called, of migrants, refugees, and asylum-seeking people. In 2016, the artist Ai Weiwei set up a studio on the Greek island of Lesbos, where hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees were arriving by boat after life-risking sea crossings on an almost daily basis, a tragedy still ongoing. He created an artwork from over 14,000 life jackets discarded on the Lesbos beaches, and it was exhibited in major European museums and venues, including Berlin's Concert House in 2016. And he went on to release a film called Human Flow, which explored related issues. Issam Courbage's Dark Water, Burning Worlds, which is interestingly at the moment on tour in England, alongside the Lampedusa Cross, visiting different cities and small towns in a British Museum exhibition called Crossings, Community and Refuge. Issam Courbage used recycled bits of bicycle mudguards and burned matches, themselves inspired by an artistic response to experiencing a visit to the Lesbos refugee camps, which he made with the poet Ruth Padal, but also inspired by a series of 5th century model ships from Tartus in Syria, which are in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, which is where Issam now lives and works. And Issam's own remarkable searing engagement through creative practice with the plight of Syrian refugees is a huge inspiration to my work. His own story, of course, being told in the process. And I'd like to use this moment to say a public thanks to his very generous spirit for sharing ideas on this research. Migration is a pressing issue of our time, and it shaped the course of elections in numerous European and North American contexts. Sandra Young, again, speaks to the significance of diasporic studies in this regard. They offer, she says, a lexicon with which to probe a world rendered more complicated through the increased mobilities of people who have been displaced through the disruptions of civil war, regional instability, economic uncertainty, or the opportunities that come with globalization. And she demonstrates in turn how the adapted and travelling Shakespeare becomes both available to and unmoored by these travelling circumstances. The scholarship of Ruben Espinosa and David Reuter, among others, has indicated that themes of migration and immigration are identified across Shakespeare's writing, amplifying the potential for Shakespeare to be adapted in these new debates and discussions. So my purpose here is to ask why increasingly in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, theatre directors, artists, novelists, filmmakers are all turning not just to Shakespeare, but to the particular Shakespearean play of Pericles to undertake cultural work to talk about refugee people and migration. I want to extrapolate from there outwards to consider briefly what that might tell us or begin to tell us about Shakespearean adaptation as process and practice, and to hint at some of the research methodologies that might be galvanized to explore it further. And I hope that will spur some conversation in a wee moment. So Pericles, Prince of Tyre, first staged, as I said, in 1608, and it enjoyed both performances at the Court and at the Globe Theatre on Bankside. Pericles is a play steeped in the romance genre. Its dramaturgy, its dramatic movements are shaped by acts of migration, relocation, by sea crossings, by storms, by family formations, partings, and reunions. And Shakespeare himself was adapting, as I hinted at, the life story of Apollonius of Tyre via earlier tellings by a medieval poet, John Gower, in the Confessio Amantis from 1393, as well as a late 16th century prose version of that story by Lawrence Twine. It's a complicated play. I'm not going to give you the whole plot, but it includes seeing Pericles embark on a quest to find a bride, a venture which ends in a life-threatening discovery of incest taking place at the heart of the kingdom of Antioch. Subsequently, after escaping Antioch, Pericles is hailed as a hero for rescuing the people of Tarsus, remember that place, from famine, and he's then shipwrecked in the first of 2 life-changing storms at sea, only to be rescued by fishermen off the coast of Pentapolis. Pages just beautifully jumped at the wrong time. Okay. In Pentapolis, Pericles falls in love with the king's daughter Thaisa, and Thaisa gives birth to their baby daughter in the second of the play's sea storms, but then seemingly loses her life in that sea storm. And Pericles has barely a moment to grieve his lost wife, as due to maritime tradition, the sailors insist that her body is immediately cast overboard. The grief-stricken Pericles leaves his baby daughter in the care of her nurse, with the same ruling family He's earlier rescued from famine in Tarsus. You can see there are loops and circles within circles here. Little realizing that the new dangers that he's left his baby daughter Marina in. And Marina, of course, her name, Marine, indicates her birth at sea. As Marina grows up, the jealous Dionysa plots to kill her. Marina survives, but in true Romance tradition, I said this was a complicated plot. In true Romance tradition, she's abducted by pirates. She's then sold on to the owners of a brothel in Mytilene, and they then attempt to sell her virginity to the highest bidder. And the play is a rolling series of movements and maritime wanderings between different but interrelated geographies and stories. Ones that have seen the presumed dead Thaisa now washed up on the shore of Ephesus, for example, an ancient Greek city on the coast of Ionia, and interestingly, another place that Amal, the puppet, visited. By the end of the play, though, Pericles will be reunited with both wife and daughter in true Romance fashion. The sea-tossed trajectories of the characters and the Mediterranean geographies of this play find particular resonance in the modern migratory and diasporic context that I've been trying to conjure for you via the Lampedusa Cross, or the work of Sandra Young, or the work of Ai Weiwei, or indeed the places visit by the walk of little Amal. Tyre, remember it's a play called Pericles, Prince of Tyre, is itself in the Lebanon. Antioch, where Pericles' problems begin, is in Syria. Marina is abducted in Tarsus, now in Turkey, and sold into prostitution in Mytilene, on the Greek island of Lesbos. Thaisa comes from Pentapolis in modern-day Libya and is washed up, coffin encased, on the shores of Ephesus, formerly in ancient Greece, now 3 kilometers southwest of modern-day Izmir in province in Turkey. Adam Smythe, writing in the London Review of Books. Pericles is a play about migration, about storm-tossed passengers who risk their lives travelling across the Mediterranean and Aegean Sea between Turkey, Lebanon, Libya and Greece. The geography of the play is the geography of our migration crisis. The medium of hope and tragedy is the sea. So the multiple storms and weather events of Pericles render this a drama of climate, says Smythe, and this is certainly relevant for reading Ali Smith's novel, as is the undertow of sexual abuse in the play, evident in plot lines from Antiochus's incest and his abuse of his unnamed daughter to the subjugation of Marina, as we've already heard, at the hands of men in a marketplace and a brothel seeking sexual gratification. And the play actually really subtly links these two women, because the first description of the unnamed daughter of Antioch is that she comes apparelled like the spring. And then when we first see Marina, and this is a picture from a Globe production in 2019, she enters bearing a basket of flowers. She looks like Flora, the goddess of spring. And the line and the image therefore links the women not only in Pericles' mind in the play, two troubled daughters, but in our imagination as the audience. And we can, of course, immediately start to connect to Ali Smith's book that I've mentioned, and her decision in her book called Spring to scaffold her novel with Pericles, among other intertexts, in order to explore the global refugee crisis and the climate emergency, and the two are very linked. Spring is the third in Ali Smith's quartet of seasonally based novels. Each of her 4 novels responds to the contemporary moment and is set in a particular season and was written at pace. They riff on what were and are Britain's unravelling politics around the question of European status and the so-called Brexit referendum at the time, around Trump's America, around activist protest movements, including Black Lives Matter, highlighting issues of systemic racism around the world, Me Too, campaigning against endemic sexual violence and harassment of women, and Extinction Rebellion, addressing the climate emergency, and much more. And each novel in this quartet of novels uses as a scaffold the work of a specific female visual artist and a specific Shakespearean late play. This is actually a wonderful Korean adaptation of Pericles, which was shown at the Asian Shakespeare Association conference that I mentioned. So I thought it was nice to put a little link to next week in there for you. Spring rethinks Pericles' Marina as a basis for the character of a 12-year-old girl called Florence. And Ali Smith is fashioning Florence as a kind of mythic figure linked to the goddess of spring, to Flora, and to Marina in Shakespeare's play. We quickly learn that Florence, like her Shakespearean precedent, despite entering dehumanized spaces like brothels and refugee detention centres, brings something redemptive, regenerative, and essentially good into the room. It's a direct parallel with how Marina's character performs in the play of Pericles. Detention centres were the spaces in which huge numbers of refugees and asylum seekers in Britain, but also in the United States and Australia at the time of Ali Smith's writing, were being interned. And the brothel space in her novel draws attention in turn to the human traffic in sex work, to which thousands of others, especially but not only women, were being subjected. And of course, both injustices persist on a global scale today. In Marina's case, in Shakespeare's play, having survived attempted murder by her guardian and abduction by pirates, poor woman threatens to put out of business the board, the head of the brothel to whom she's been sold into prostitution. She's able to freeze the god Priapus and undo a whole generation. In Smith's novel, Florence has a similar transformative impact on behaviour in the detention centre that she enters. She leads hardened employees to suddenly start to clean the place up. And you'll remember perhaps some of the scandals around the detention centres that Donald Trump's regime had, where there was no clean water, where toilets were not cleaned for weeks, where the conditions in which people were being held were quite simply inhuman. The focus, via Florence's almost angelic intervention on the unsanitary conditions of the detention centre, deliberately bring to mind these comparable stories. Ali Spring doesn't have to tell you this. She lets you play with the network and to make those connections for yourself. Rumours fly around about Florence's provenance. There are claims she arrived from Greece in a dinghy, that she crossed the world dressed in a Manchester United football shirt, that her mother drowned in a boat off of Italy, Lampedusa, echoing around the story. As with Amal and the Walk Project, Florence, we learn, is searching for her mother, who has taken refugee status. Florence becomes then a composite of multiple migrant stories and images circulating in the world press and on social media, including Lampedusa and Lesbos, as referred to earlier, as frames of reference. Perilous boat crossings from Syria and Eritrea to Europe provide modern analogues to the tragic experiences at sea of Pericles, Thaisa and Marina in the Shakespeare source. And although Shakespeare's characters are noble-born and possess a very different level of agency to the modern-day migrants whose story Smith is seeking to articulate, there remains a resonance in the restless arc of the sea-born mobilities. Remember that mobilities, those travelling stories that Sandra Young talked about, that the play depicts. Florence's actions in Spring invite us as readers to question the criminalisation of anyone seeking sanctuary in the modern era for reasons of economic or personal security. And this is the quote from the play where you see Marina appalling the board because she's sort of undermining the whole of the work of the brothel with her prayers and her knees, making a Puritan of the devil. And this is the version of it that we're told in Ali Smith's Spring. The story went that the police had been called in by the pimps because she got in there in the space of half an hour, had gone through several rooms, persuading clients out of doing what they were in the middle of doing. For all of her disruptive impact in the institutional spaces and geographies of the novel, like the puppet Amal, Florence is still resolutely a young girl. Her favourite colour is turquoise. If she was an animal, we're told she would be a pink fairy armadillo. And her favourite day of the week is Friday. We have an old children's nursery rhyme about Friday's child is full of grace. And it's clear that Ali Smith plays on that, this idea of Marina and Florence as good, as figures of grace. But of course, with her customary sleight of hand, Ali Smith also quietly, therefore, connects her redemptive young female protagonist not only with the 16-year-old Marina in Shakespeare's play, but in turn with the climate emergency protests, Fridays for Future, that had been initiated by the then 16-year-old Greta Thunberg in Sweden in 2018, of course, a global youth protest movement. Florence's wish to travel to Scotland with no footprint occludes double meaning in the context of the climate emergency. And Smith's novel makes deep use of Shakespeare's Pericles and themes of shipwreck, famine, war, sexual violence, biological and affective families, fathers and daughters, youth and redemption, but she remakes them in its own time and place to speak to now, as in the way of so much adaptation and endeavour. The adaptive scaffold that Shakespeare's play provides for the emotional and political impact of Smith's novel is pivotal because it mobilises these core themes of migration, climate and identity, but in newly conceived global and local contexts. And as I've argued in an extended essay on this novel in relation to another Pericles-inspired novel of the same year by Mark Haddon, The Porpoise, it mobilises the play's theme of hope. No time to discuss the Haddon in any detail, but another really interesting response to Pericles and part of this cluster that's building in my mind. Also part of the cluster is a film, and I'm not going to say a lot about it, but it's true to say, I mean, Pericles has not had an extensive sort of filmic afterlife as something like Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet has, but it has had a number of cinematic retellings, and one of those was Robert Quagliano's Italian director's Pericles by Shakespeare on the Road, Italian production made in the direct context of the 2014-2015 European migration issues. It tells the story of an itinerant group travelling on foot through desolate areas. It's predominantly in modern Italian, but it retains some original Shakespearean textual references in translation. And the sequences move between endless roads and highways, another form of mobility, against the background of surveillance helicopters. The focus is on a young girl and her father, and the girl dreams the story of Pericles. In her dream, actually, her fellow travellers appear still dressed in modern clothing, so not quite fully incorporated into the ancient story, so the lines between past and present being played with. The dream is like the film itself, an act of adaptation and appropriation, like Haddon's book, The Porpoise, melding ancient tale with contemporary images, objects, and issues. Pericles, through these new meldings of ancient tale with issues of migration, climate justice, social justice, sexual abuse, becomes a play finding new present purpose in our contemporary moment. And theatre productions of the play have demonstrated parallel interests in these topics of sexual violence, sex trafficking, homelessness, unsettled status, migration, and that Public Act's production at the National Theatre was one of those. The adaptations make the case that Shakespeare is as often adapted in the 21st century for what his texts can say about the present time as for what his plays were staging or responding to in their own moment of performance. And we could ask then, how much does Shakespeare matter in any of this? How present is the actual work of Shakespeare? How far has adaptation meant that we've travelled from source and to what extent is a knowledge of the Shakespeare play even necessary for a reading of, for example, Ali Smith's Spring? Well, as I hope that comparative analysis that I'm briefly touching on here today suggests, there's mutual purpose in studying these contemporary works as Shakespeare adaptations. For the Shakespeare student, I hope there's much to discover and be challenged by in the remakings and reimaginings of contemporary adapters. And in turn, for those whose point of entry might be the work of fiction, film, or other creative format, then the links to Shakespeare can prove both enriching and empowering. In the summer of 2019, the climate campaigner Greta Thunberg took 2 weeks to sail to New York to attend the United Nations climate summits. On her arrival into harbour, she was greeted by a series of sailing boats, each of them depicting one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which serve to focus our collective attention on the global social issues of our times: the right to clean water and sanitation, to education, to gender equality, to clean energy, and so on, to peace and to justice. Many of these issues, as I hope you are seeing, corresponding directly with the themes and concerns of the theatrical, novel, and film adaptations of Pericles that I've been just gesturing towards in this talk. As well as engaging in sea battles and oceanic adventures, in Pericles, the protagonist is also a bringer of aid. As I say, he brought food to a place of famine. He brings well-being. He brings liberation to incarcerated women. The play, despite its sometimes dark heart of incest and sex trafficking and violence, is still hopeful then about the values of harbourage, as the play calls it, and the importance of hospitality, the giving of welcome, the giving of asylum, and the being of a sanctuary space. The creative and ethical engagement with the play that adaptations like Ali Smith's novel or Roberto Quagliano's film perform therefore share, evolve, and augment these profound investigations of what constitutes humanity in complex circumstances. Adaptation demands active makers, readers, spectators, and researchers, ones who travel with the Shakespearean text through and across times, cultures, and contexts, and who continue to ask probing questions even in the most difficult or unsettling times. I said I would come full circle. I felt that in talking about a play like Pericles, which is so circular and looping, that the lecture needed to play with that experiment itself. And of course, I'm playing with the circle of the globe. You know where I am. Because Amal did visit the Globe Theatre itself at London's Bankside on that Saturday that I described when I walked with her from dawn till dusk in October. And what the actors spoke and sang to her is really interesting. They spoke lines from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, which was the play that they were about to perform that afternoon as a matinee production in the theatre, hence the costumes of the actors that you can see standing on the steps of the Globe Theatre here. Twelfth Night itself is a play about shipwreck and sundered families. It's a theme Shakespeare himself loops around from his earliest plays like the Comedy of Errors, set in Ephesus, you can see the links, right through to end late plays like The Tempest and Pericles. Twelfth Night is about shipwreck and sundered families, about fear and reinvention. It involves landing on an unknown coastline and a young woman seeking harbourage and hospitality. Viola's first lines in the play, "What country, friend, is this?" And the actors also, in a remarkable collective performance, delivered the speech from the co-authored early modern play, Sir Thomas More, which is about refugees. And interestingly, we believe Shakespeare to have had a hand in the writing of this play. And quite literally, the speech about refugees, which they performed, in its archival extant survival in a manuscript, appears to be in hand D, which is believed to be the hand of Shakespeare. So make of that what you will. Indulge me, because I'm going to read the quotes to you. Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs, and their poor luggage plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation. And you, in your ruff of opinion clothed. Say now the king should so much come too short of your great trespass as but to banish you. Whither would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbour? Go you to France or Flanders, to any German province, to Spain or Portugal? Why, you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper that breaking out in hideous violence would not afford you an abode on earth? I drink some water. This is the strangest, sorry, my voice has got, this is the strangest case, and this your mountainish inhumanity. I want to end, though, not on mountainish inhumanity, but on the remarkable welcome that little Amal received, and thousands on thousands who turned out to see her and who took positive action as a result in their communities did as a result. In Shakespeare's play, Pericles' armour is lifted from the seas by the local fishermen of Pentapolis, and it's inscribed with a phrase about hope. In hope we live, it translates as. The name Amal means hope in Arabic. So we keep hoping We keep adapting. We keep making collective sense of global challenges. We keep trying to tell and to retell stories in the process as an act of becoming, as an act of being. Hope springs eternal. Enter Marina with a basket of flowers. Thank you.